Welcome to you, and thank you for joining me as we begin a series of studies in this amazing book of Isaiah. Isaiah is, of course, the longest book in the Bible, apart from the Psalms, which is, in essence, a collection of separate literary units. It's interesting, and I don't want to put any more stress on it than to say it's interesting, that Isaiah is in some ways like a miniature Bible. It's made up of 66 chapters in two main sections, the first being 39 and the second being 27. It is a hugely important and influential book. The New Testament contains more than 400 quotations from Isaiah's prophecy, and many of its verses and phrases have passed into common usage in literature. For example, the Penguin Dictionary of Quotations has 70 quotations from Isaiah, and much of its language is employed in Handel's Messiah. The Apostle Paul clearly delighted in Isaiah's ministry. He quotes more than 40 times from Isaiah's prophecy in his letters. And maybe that was partly due because when God called and commissioned Paul, he quoted from Isaiah 42. Isaiah has been variously called the Prince of the Prophets, the Saint Paul of the Old Testament, the prophet of the gospel before the gospel, the fifth gospel, or my favorite is the first gospel. Isaiah is both well known and at the same time neglected. Some parts, like chapter 6 or 40 or 53, are among the best known sections of the Old Testament, but vast tracts of Isaiah are effectively unknown to most believers. Now, friends, ignorance of any part of Scripture is to be deplored, but especially ignorance of a book that speaks so richly of Christ. This book as a whole presents a majestic, moving view of Christ, but also an awe-inspiring view of God, the Holy One of Israel, to use Isaiah's favorite description of God. Now I'm going to take the first four studies in this new series just to set the scene for Isaiah, all based on the first verse of the first chapter. And in this first study, I want to introduce you to the man Isaiah. This is what we read in Scripture, the vision of Isaiah, the son of Amos. So what do we know about Isaiah? Well, as with many of the Old Testament prophets, we actually know very little about Isaiah the man. We know that his name means Yahweh saves. We know that his father was a man called Amos. We know from chapter 8, verse 3, that he was married to a prophetess. We know that he was the father of at least two sons. Chapter 7, verse 3 mentions Shear-Jashub, whose name means a remnant shall return. And chapter 8, verse 3 mentions the wonderfully named Mahashalal-Hashbaz, whose name means the spoil speeds or the prey hastens. In addition to that, we know that he lived and ministered in Jerusalem, where he had ready access to the king of Judah. Jewish tradition tells us that Isaiah was of noble, even royal stock, and was possibly the brother of King Amaziah. It also tells us that Isaiah was sawn in two during the reign of the godless king Manasseh. What is clear is that Isaiah, the son of Amos, was a theologian, a reformer, a statesman, a historian, a poet, an orator, a prince, and a patriot. He was called to a prophetic ministry, as we know from chapter 6, but knowing full well that it would be hard going and in many ways fruitless, as he ministered to an unresponsive people whose hearts were hardened against God. It's not difficult to see, is it, why comparisons are drawn between Isaiah in the Old Testament and Paul in the New Testament. So having taken a brief look at the man today, join me for our second study, still counting verse 1 of this prophecy, where we'll look at the monarchs, the kings during whose reign Isaiah prophesied. And that will also help us understand the situation into which Isaiah ministered.